Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again, G. Michael Vasey. And this is the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast. Well, I've written 30, 40 books now, and many of them were dedicated to various aspects of the paranormal, ghost stories, My Haunted Life, Your Haunted Life, Haunted Czech Republic, all of those books, my best-selling Black Eyed Kids books, and many others. And of all the paranormal phenomena that I've been exposed to in one shape or another, and trust me, I've had a haunted life myself, the idea that you could be in two places at once was always something that struck me as not just paranormal, but magical. And as you all know, I'm very interested in magic, and I see magic everywhere, as should you. So it was kind of interesting when a few years ago I was calling my mother at home in England from the Czech Republic, and she asked me a very strange question. She said to me, "You're psychic. So what does it mean when you see the ghost of someone still alive?" She swallowed before asking the inevitable follow-up question almost breathlessly. "Does it mean they're going to die soon?" To be honest, I didn't have an answer, and instead asked for more detail. She swore that in the last week she had, on 3 separate occasions, seen her sister. "She was solid and right here in the kitchen when I turned around. I jumped a mile," said my mother. She was also seen looking in through the small window by the front door, something most folk do after ringing the doorbell. And then again, my mum saw her in the living room. I didn't really know what to tell her, so I said, "Well, I don't know, to be honest, but I wouldn't worry about it." However, I was intrigued. Ghosts of the living? What a topic. Now, a few thoughts did cross my mind. Doppelgangers, astral projection, bilocation, hallucination. None of them seemed to fit, except perhaps the latter. But 3 times in a week, not since repeated? So perhaps we can rule that out too. My mother's not hallucinating. So I felt prompted to research the phenomena. Doppelgangers are doubles or lookalikes of a living person, and they're often said to be the harbingers of bad luck and ill fortune. They can also sometimes be thought of as the evil twin. Did you know that there's also a website these days where you can register and try to find your own doppelganger, should you be interested? There's lots of stories of people finding their lookalikes in real life, including one quite widely reported story of a man who boarded a Ryanair flight and found himself sat next to himself. However, true doppelgangers are much more sinister beings. A true doppelganger is a wraith, or an apparition double, or replica of a living person that casts no shadow. If a relative saw a doppelganger of a loved one, it was felt to portend illness. Whereas seeing your own doppelganger was even worse because it meant certain death. Doppelgangers spell trouble, so they say. I decided fairly quickly that this wasn't a doppelganger. There was no physical person involved, obviously walking around my mum's house. So what else could it be? Well, many years ago, I got into Dennis Wheatley books after watching the Hammer House of Horror movie of his book called The Devil Rides Out. But it's another of his books called The Car of Gifford Hillary, in which a man is prematurely interred and uses his astral self to eventually find a way to get himself freed, that we find a clue. The Egyptians called this astral body the car, hence the title of the book. And I recall being compelled by the story to start an investigation of astral projection and spent many hours as a student trying to do this. I never had much success, but I'm told some people can do it at will. Maybe you can. Let me know if you can. My only possible success took place one evening as a student, and the story's not really worth telling because it was a very short-lived affair. Another possibility is bilocation, which is the term used to describe someone being in two places at the same time. Funnily enough, it's not as rare as you might think. In fact, bilocation is often something attributed to saints and other holy people who can earn their sainthood by actually being ghosts of the living. ParaWiki describes bilocation as bilocation, or sometimes multi-location, is a term used to describe the ability in which an individual or object is said to be, or appears to be, located in two distinct places at the same instant and time. Bilocation is a physical rather than spiritual phenomenon, and a person experiencing it is supposed to be able to interact with their surroundings as normal, including being able to experience sensations and to manipulate physical objects exactly as if they'd arrived through natural means. This makes it distinct from astral projection. In most instances, bilocation is said to be involuntary and not to have been directed by the individual concerned in terms of time or space. Well, there are quite a number of saints of the Catholic Church who have been credited with this miraculous ability. Trust me, the list is very long, and I'll just pick a couple of illustrative examples. One is, and forgive my pronunciation, Saint Alphonsus Mary de Liguori, who was seen in two places at once, in the pulpit preaching a sermon and at the same time taking confession. Yes, on the morning of September 21st, 1774, a companion of St. Alphonsus watched him sit in an armchair where he appeared to be lost in thought. In fact, he stayed like that for several hours, almost 24 hours to be precise. He was asked what had been wrong, and he told his companion that he'd been assisting Pope Clement, who had just died. Well, it took a little time for the news of the Pope's death in Rome to arrive, but when it did, the Pope, in fact died at the very time that St. Alphonsus had been seated in a trance. Another one involves St. Paul of the Cross. And after seeing St. Paul of the Cross board a ship and staying on the quay until the ship was very distant, Dr. Gherardini was surprised to see St. Paul of the Cross emerging from a room at a friend's house. He approached him and asked how it were possible that he was in the house, since he'd just returned from putting him on the ship. And St. Paul is reputed to have replied, "Be still, I came here for an act of charity," before promptly disappearing. Among many other stories is the stories of Padre Pio, and perhaps the best documented example is that of Padre Pio, and numerous instances of bilocation that have been cited, including the testimony of Father Alberto, who met Padre Pio in 1917. I saw Padre Pio standing in front of the window, looking at the mountain. He was speaking to himself. I approached him in order to kiss his hand, but he did not notice my presence, and I noticed that his hand was very rigid. At that time I heard he was clearly giving absolution and pardon to someone. After a while, Padre Pio shook like awakening from a nap. He looked at me and said, "You are here. I did not realize it." After some days, a telegram from Turin was delivered. Someone was thanking the superior of the convent for having sent Padre Pio to Turin to assist a dying person. I realized that the man was dying in the same moment Padre Pio was blessing him in San Giovanni Rotondo. Obviously, the superior of the convent had not sent Padre Pio to Turin, but he had bilocated there. There are many other stories about Padre Pio, and the ability to bilocate, or be in two places at once is used as a way to demonstrate holiness in the church. Yet this ability is not limited to churchmen. Maria Coronel de Agreda, a 16th century Franciscan abbess, was also said to have the ability. She instructed natives in Christianity in Mexico, distributing rosaries as she did so, while all the while in her room in Spain. Apparently the rosaries that she gave out disappeared from her room where they were stored, and a priest, returning from a trip to Mexico, came back telling strange tales about a woman in a habit, who the natives had claimed had instructed them in the faith. Another religious woman who experienced bilocation was schoolteacher Teresa Higginson, and she bilocated to remote countries like Africa to teach the natives there and sometimes baptize them too. Interestingly enough, it's not just saints that have the ability to bilocate, but also magicians, alchemists, and philosophers. Paracelsus was a famous alchemist and a doctor who was often seen in two places at once. The ageless and seemingly immortal Saint Germain was also credited with bilocations on multiple occasions. But what is bilocation? Is it an hallucination? Well, there are so many verified stories of people being in two places at once that hallucination seems more far-fetched than astral travel, if you ask me. But if bilocation is astral travel, how is it that the person's body appears physical, solid and real? In the case of Alex Tannis, who was sitting in his chair in New York, showed up at a friend's house in Canada, conversed and drank tea before leaving, there is documentation of a physical double actually drinking that hot tea. In the last days of Vladimir Lenin's life, as he lay seriously ill with an assassin's bullet still in his neck and having suffered multiple strokes, he was also seen in his office in the Kremlin, rummaging around looking for papers in his desk. In fact, the duty officer was prompted to call his superior, apparently, asking why Lenin was in his office without any guard or protection. He was duly informed that Lenin was still at home, sick in bed. Bilocation is also a phenomenon that occurs in the Bible and has been documented for centuries by the Church and in other writings. The Church views it as miraculous, and all one has to do is Google the term to come up with many different examples. The fascinating thing about bilocation is that the double appears to have physical substance, can talk and discuss, take conscious actions, and even consume food and drink. Under this heading of bilocation, I might also look at the ability to send the voice to another location without the body. In these examples, someone's voice is heard, perhaps warning of danger despite the physical person being many miles away. I had such an example submitted to my Haunted Life 2 website recently. It went like this. My mother, grandmother and little brothers had come to visit me in Paris. It was one of those hit-and-run weekenders where they arrived late one Saturday morning and left early on Sunday afternoon. There was no time for them to come out to the village where I lived and worked, a short train journey outside of Paris. So we celebrated my 21st birthday instead in Montmartre. It was a tearful leave-taking. It'd been wonderful to see my family for the first time in a year. My mother and I had always been very close, so close in fact that more often than not our letters would cross in the post answering questions we'd not yet received. I went to bed that night missing her horribly and cried myself to sleep. Around 2 a.m, I heard my mother calling my name. Susie? I sat up wide awake. Susie. No one else ever called me like that, and her voice is one that I could not fail to recognize. There was urgency in her tone. There was no one there. I was still in the village on the edge of Paris, and my mother would be in Boulogne ready to board the ferry. Blaming the emotions of the day, I called myself an imaginative fool. Even so, I got up and checked, so clear was that voice. And I heard it again, standing wide awake and shivering on the stairs. I could not shake the sense of unease. I knew something was wrong. But this was a time when all mail went in envelopes and international phone calls were too expensive to contemplate. My employers were concerned too, and after several days of watching me fret, told me to phone England. Dad, is everything all right? You'd better speak to your mother. I waited, worrying, until I heard my mother's voice. Susie? She sounded odd. The tone was the same as always, but the voice sounded slurred and unfamiliar. Slowly she told me what had happened. The coach had arrived at Boulogne. She'd been feeling unwell for a little while, but put it down to missing me and the fatigue of the journey. As soon as the ferry had left the port, she collapsed. They told her later that she'd suffered a stroke. She knew little of what was going on around her, but remembered calling my name. She said she'd dreamed that she was lost and was trying to reach me and knew that if she could find me, she would be safe. My mother described the dream in detail, and it was, without any doubt, the route I'd taken from the train to my home, a route that I walked every day, but which she had never seen. She described the big house behind its screen of trees, the tiny lizards that skittered away with every footfall as you walked the path along the edge of the forest, even the wild flowers and wild strawberries down to the very last detail. I still have the diaries of that time, but I do not need them in order to remember. I did not see my mother's living ghost, but I heard her voice calling when she was unconscious from halfway across France. Submitted by Sue Vincent. What a beautiful story. So I gradually did the research and came to the conclusion that ghosts of the living are a strange and can be scary phenomenon, but I think that some answers might be found by revisiting the doppelganger and bilocation experiences specifically. Bilocation is something that's been accepted by the church and is documented in the Bible. Examples of the ability to bilocate can be found, as I said, among religious people, mystics, shamans, magicians, and so on. They sometimes also appear to occur at times of stress or danger. So what if at least part of the doppelganger legend was related to an unconscious bilocation? Plainly, seeing your own double isn't what I have in mind, but if you think back to the stories and commentary that I've presented so far, most of them dealt with seeing other people's doubles, particularly my mother's. If you recall, the double was often described as silent, unaware of people around it, non-responsive, and evil. If a person were unconsciously bilocating, how would they appear? Physically present but unaware? How could that vacantness come across? Cold? Evil? Perhaps? When reading accounts of people who bilocated, they describe being enraptured, inflamed, and certainly being in a trance-like state. While some of these people appear to consciously bilocate in order to explicitly assist or aid someone, many of the accounts appear to be unconscious. As we've seen, people can project their voice across time and space in certain circumstances involving danger or stress, so perhaps others can unconsciously bilocate too. I can imagine washing the dishes, lost in thought, and perhaps thinking of being somewhere, anywhere but where I am. At that exact time, you're observed standing in your favourite spot looking absent-minded. Someone talks to you, but you do not respond, as if unaware that you're being spoken to. For you, you were simply lost in a thought. But for the person who saw your double, you were a doppelganger. A living ghost. If you like this podcast, please do like and share. Tell people about it. Perhaps visit my website, GaryMVasey.com, or submit your ghost story, paranormal experience at www.myhauntedlife2.com. If you'd like to support my activities, please do visit the Patreon page and perhaps sign up for a little magical item or two. Please do come back and listen in another time. In the next couple of editions, I've got a couple of really good interviews coming up. I'll be talking to Alan Greenberg and Tim Walters in the next 2 editions. So for now, don't unconsciously bilocate. You might scare somebody. Thank you for listening. This is G. Michael Vasey. Goodbye.